In 1847 in West Virginia, a man came home from jail and found out his wife was going to have a baby, and his brother was the father. But instead of getting angry, he smiled. Within 1 week, he turned his wife into a business. He made his 4 brothers pay him money every month to be with her. He wrote everything down in a special notebook, like people write down information about farm animals. 14 children were born, and they didn't know who their real fathers were. But the woman kept her own records, and her patience turned out to be more deadly than any of them imagined. Before we start the story, please click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the disturbing cases we share here. Also, I'd love it if you could comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The prison wagon stopped at the edge of Blackwater Hollow in the spring. Its wheels left deep marks in mud that was still soft from winter melting. Silas Brenner climbed down. His things were stuffed into one cloth bag. His clothes hung loose on his body that had gotten thinner during 3 years behind stone walls. The jail in Charleston had been hard on him, leaving him with a cough that wouldn't go away and eyes that had learned to look for opportunities in the dim light of shared cells. He stood for a moment, breathing the mountain air. He looked across the valley where his family's cabin sat against the tree line. Smoke rose from the chimney, and he could see people moving in the yard. He thought they were his 4 brothers, working the land he'd left behind when people he owed money to had him arrested. The coal mine on the property had barely made money back then, but 3 years was enough time for things to change. Silas walked the last mile on foot. His boots crunched on gravel. His mind was already working through how to survive. He'd learned in prison that every situation could be turned into a deal, that human dignity was just another thing to be bought and sold. These lessons had hardened him in ways that being alone and hungry never could. The cabin came into view clearly now. It was bigger than he remembered. New parts had been added to the original building. The rough wood was still pale and new. Someone had put work into the place, had spent time and effort. That meant money. That meant the mine had made money while he was gone. His youngest brother, Thomas, saw him first from the yard. He dropped the axe he'd been using to chop wood and stood frozen. Then Marcus came out from the barn, followed by James and William. All 4 brothers gathered in a tight group. Their faces showed a mix of relief and something else. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Silas noticed right away that someone was missing. His wife, Abigail, did not come to the door. She did not rush out to greet her husband, who was returning after 3 years of being separated. The door stayed closed, and through the window he could see movement. A shadow that moved deeper into the cabin. Thomas stepped forward first. His hands hung awkwardly at his sides. "Silas, we didn't know you were coming today." The letter said next month. "I got out early," Silas said. His voice was rougher than it had been, damaged by prison air and silence. "Good behavior. Where's Abigail?" The brothers looked at each other, a silent conversation that Silas understood right away. They were hiding something big enough that 4 grown men looked like children caught doing something wrong. "She's inside," Marcus said finally. "But Silas, there's something you need to know. Something that happened while you were gone." Silas pushed past them. His patience was already thin. He entered the cabin. The inside was warm and well kept. It had better furniture than when he'd left. A proper table, matching chairs, curtains on the windows. Someone had made this into a real home, had built something comfortable. Abigail stood near the fireplace with her back to him. One hand was resting protectively on her swollen belly. She was very pregnant, maybe 7 months along. When she finally turned to face him, her eyes held no joy at his return, only resignation and something deeper, despair maybe, or the hollow acceptance of someone who had already mourned. Silas looked at his wife, at her pregnant belly, at his brothers crowded in the doorway behind him. He felt something cold settle in his chest. Not rage like they all expected, not the explosive violence of a husband who had been betrayed. Instead, his mind began calculating, measuring, weighing possibilities against opportunities. And slowly, terribly, a smile spread across his face. Silas called a meeting that evening after supper. His brothers sat around the table with the nervous energy of men waiting for punishment. Abigail stood by the fireplace, her hands twisted in her apron. Her pregnant belly was a constant reminder of the betrayal that hung in the air like smoke. Thomas got her pregnant while I was locked away, Silas said. His voice was eerily calm. That much is obvious. What I want to know is whether the rest of you took your turns as well. The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus stared at his hands. James shifted in his chair. William, barely 20 years old, looked ready to run out the door. I see, Silas continued. He pulled a leather notebook from his bag and placed it on the table carefully. 3 years is a long time. A man gets lonely. I understand that. But here's what you don't understand. While you were enjoying my wife's company, I was learning something valuable in that prison. He opened the notebook, showing blank pages waiting to be filled. Everything is a deal. Work, loyalty, even people. And I've come home to find that I own something far more valuable than I realized. Abigail's breath caught. Silas, what are you saying? I'm saying we're going to make this official. He pulled out documents from his bag, papers with official seals. These are debt papers. Each of you owes money for the mine expansion, for the equipment you bought using my credit. According to West Virginia law, I can demand payment in any form I choose. Thomas stood up suddenly. You can't be serious. She's a person, not property to be traded. Sit down, Silas commanded. His voice dropped to something dangerous. Or I call the sheriff tonight and have you all arrested for stealing. The mine legally belongs to me. Every tool, every wagon, every dollar you've earned while I was gone is stolen. I could have you all in chains by morning. The brothers sat frozen, understanding the trap that had closed around them. Silas had learned more than survival in prison. He'd learned how to use the law itself as a weapon. Here's the new arrangement, Silas continued, turning pages in his notebook. Abigail will rotate between all 5 of us on a monthly schedule. I'll write down everything in this book. Dates, rotations, and when children arrive, who the father is based on timing. Each of you will pay me 30% of your mining wages for the privilege. That's monstrous, Marcus whispered. That's business, Silas corrected. You've already proven you want access to my wife. I'm simply setting the terms. You can accept them and continue living here, working the mine, keeping your freedom, or you can refuse, and I'll have you arrested and punished to the fullest extent. Abigail moved toward the door, but Silas blocked her path. These papers also give me full legal authority over you. Try to leave and I'll have the law drag you back. Try to refuse and I'll withhold food and shelter. Everything. You have no family to run to. No money of your own. You're trapped here just as surely as I was trapped in that cell, fat woman. She saw the truth in his eyes. Prison hadn't broken Silas. It had perfected him. It had stripped away whatever humanity he might have had and replaced it with cold calculation. He'd become something mechanical, something that measured the world only in terms of profit and control. The rotation begins next week, Silas announced, pulling out a small cloth bag. We'll draw names for the order, fair and democratic. I'll take the first month naturally to re-establish my claim. Then the rest of you follow according to what you draw. William found his voice finally, though it shook. And if we refuse, all of us together? Silas smiled that terrible smile again. Then I burn the mine entrance tomorrow, collapse the tunnels, and report you all for attempted murder of a returning prisoner. There are witnesses at the prison who will testify I feared for my life coming home. You'll hang within a month. The brothers looked at each other, then at Abigail, then at the documents spread across the table. They saw no escape. Silas had spent 3 years planning this moment. He'd arrived with legal weapons already prepared and ready. Marcus reached into the bag first. His hand trembled as he drew a folded paper, then James, then William, finally Thomas, who looked at Abigail with eyes full of apologies she could never accept. Silas recorded their names in order in his notebook. His handwriting was neat and precise. Below the schedule, he began a new section labeled Financial Records. This wasn't impulse or madness. This was a system he'd designed with the same care other men might plan a business. That night, Abigail lay awake in the bed she'd once shared with Silas alone. She listened to him breathe beside her and understood that her life had just become a form of slavery more complete than any slavery. She was to be treated like livestock, rotated and documented, bred and recorded, all in service of one man's twisted sense of justice. Thomas's daughter arrived in late summer. She was a tiny thing with dark hair and eyes that would never know the truth of how she was conceived. Silas recorded the birth in his notebook with cold precision, noting the date, the child's weight, and next to father, he wrote Thomas's name in careful writing. Below that, he added the money calculation of wages collected during Abigail's pregnancy. They named her Sarah at Abigail's insistence, though Silas cared little for what the children were called. To him, they were entries in a book, proof that his system worked as designed. He built a separate column tracking each brother's payments, checking boxes when wages arrived on schedule, adding penalty notes when they didn't. The monthly rotation became routine with sickening efficiency. On the first day of each new month, whichever brother's turn it was would move his belongings into the main bedroom, while the previous occupant returned to the bunkhouse the brothers shared. Silas enforced the schedule with rigid authority, allowing no changes, no extensions, no mercy. Marcus tried to be gentle during his months, speaking softly to Abigail, bringing her wildflowers from the mountain slopes, attempting to preserve some dignity in the arrangement. But kindness made it worse somehow. His guilt was visible in every careful touch, every whispered apology. Abigail found she preferred James's cold efficiency to Marcus's tortured conscience. James treated the rotation as duty, nothing more. He was rough but quick, mechanical in his approach. He spent his evenings drinking whiskey in the bunkhouse rather than attempting conversation. He'd become Silas's most reliable enforcer, collecting payments from the other brothers, reporting any rule violations, earning himself reduced rates through loyalty. William struggled most visibly with the arrangement. At 19, he'd never been with a woman before Silas put this system in place. The wrongness of it ate at him constantly. He spent his months with Abigail in tormented silence, often sleeping on the floor rather than sharing the bed, crying sometimes in the darkness when he thought she couldn't hear. Thomas was different. He'd fathered Sarah and had loved Abigail before Silas's return. During his rotation months, he acted almost like a husband. He spoke of the future, of escape plans that never happened, of taking Abigail and Sarah away from Blackwater Hollow. She'd learned not to believe him, but his delusions provided temporary comfort in the endless cycle of months. By the time Sarah learned to walk, Abigail was pregnant again. The notebook documented Marcus as the likely father based on timing, though the rotation made certainty impossible. Silas didn't care about accuracy, only about maintaining the appearance of order. The system required documentation, and documentation required fathers to be assigned. The cabin became a prison with invisible bars. Abigail had nowhere to run with an infant and another child coming. The nearest town was 15 miles through mountain wilderness, and Silas kept all money locked in a strong box only he could access. She'd tried once to slip away during Marcus's rotation month. She made it 3 miles before James tracked her down and dragged her back. Silas beat her that night, methodically and without anger, the way a man might discipline livestock. Then he recorded the incident in his notebook under a section labeled Disciplinary Actions and reduced all 4 brothers' wages to pay for the time lost searching for her. The mountains surrounded them, beautiful and uncaring. Inside the cabin, a woman's life was reduced to monthly transactions recorded in neat columns. The brothers went to work each dawn in the coal mine, their labor funding their own participation in horror. They returned each evening covered in black dust, washed at the pump outside, and sat down to meals Abigail prepared with hands that had forgotten what freedom felt like. Sometimes at night, she'd stand at the window holding Sarah, looking out at the dark shapes of mountains against darker sky. She would calculate how many years she might survive this. She was 24. Her body was already showing wear from constant pregnancy and labor. If she lived to 40, that meant 16 more years. If each year brought a child, that meant 16 more entries in Silas's notebook. 16 more lives born into confusion and shame. The math of her own destruction was as precise as anything in Silas's documentation. And somewhere in those calculations, in the cold certainty of endless months rotating between 5 men, a different kind of math began forming in her mind. The arithmetic of revenge. Dr. Raymond Tucker had practiced medicine in the Appalachian territories for 20 years, long enough to recognize desperation in a woman's eyes. The woman standing before him now, giving him directions to the Fletcher farm, had that look. Something beyond exhaustion from frontier life. Something that spoke of ongoing trauma. "Are you well, ma'am?" he asked, getting off his horse. "You seem distressed." Abigail's throat tightened. The words she'd kept buried for years pushed against her teeth, demanding release. "I need help," she whispered, glancing back at the cabin. "Please, you have to understand what's happening here." The doctor moved closer. His weathered face showed concern. "What's wrong? Are you injured?" "Worse than injured." The words tumbled out in a rush. "My husband came back from prison and he made an arrangement. He forces me to rotate between him and his 4 brothers every month. He writes it down in a notebook like I'm livestock. He sells access to me and keeps the money. I've had 10 children and I don't know which man fathered half of them." Dr. Tucker's expression shifted from concern to horror. "That's impossible. No man could enforce such a thing. He has legal documents, debt papers. He threatened his brothers with arrest if they refuse. He threatened me with starvation if I run. We're 15 miles from town with no money, no help. Please, you have to report this to the authorities. You have to bring someone who can stop him." The doctor reached for his medical bag. His hands moved with purpose. "I'll examine you first, document any injuries. Then I'll write straight to the county sheriff. This is slavery, plain and simple. West Virginia law doesn't permit this kind of arrangement, regardless of what papers he claims to have." Relief flooded through Abigail so powerfully her knees weakened. Finally, someone who believed her, someone who would act. She led him toward the cabin, speaking quickly about the years of abuse, the children's confusion, the brothers' participation. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the tree line. Silas had returned early from town, approaching through the forest rather than the main road. He'd seen the doctor's horse and had crept close enough to hear every word Abigail spoke. His face showed no emotion as he listened to his wife betray him to a stranger. Inside the cabin, Dr. Tucker examined Abigail's medical history through careful questions. 11 pregnancies in 8 years. Her body worn beyond her actual age. He took notes in his own notebook, building a case. "This is barbaric," he muttered. "I'll have the sheriff here within 2 days. Can you and the children stay safe until then?" "I think so," Abigail said. Hope kindled in her chest for the first time in years. "Silas won't know you were here unless someone tells him." But Silas already knew. He waited in the woods until the doctor left, watched him ride away toward town. Then he entered the cabin through the back door. Abigail was preparing supper, humming softly. Her movements were lighter than they'd been in years. "Had a visitor today," Silas said casually from the doorway. Abigail spun around. Her face drained of color. "How long have you been standing there?" "Long enough." He moved into the room. His steps were measured. "Long enough to hear you chatting with that doctor. Long enough to understand you've decided to destroy everything I've built here." "Silas, please." Where was he headed? "The Fletcher farm, you said." Abigail's blood turned cold. "What are you going to do?" "What I have to do." Silas pulled on his heavy coat and checked the rifle mounted above the door. "Can't have him reaching town with stories about our private family arrangements. People might misunderstand. You can't. He's a doctor. People will look for him. Accidents happen in the mountains," Silas said, loading the rifle with practiced efficiency. "Cliffs are steep. Horses spook. Tragic, really, when a good man trying to help people takes a fatal fall." He left through the front door, and Abigail collapsed against the table, understanding what she'd done. She'd sentenced the doctor to death. Her only chance at rescue had become another victim of Silas's methodical cruelty. That night, Silas returned alone. His clothes were torn. Mud was on his boots. He said nothing. Just added an entry to his notebook under a new section he titled, "External Threats Neutralized." Then he turned to Abigail with eyes colder than she'd ever seen. "That was your one mistake," he said quietly. "You won't get another chance." Dr. Tucker's body was discovered 3 days later at the bottom of a cliff near Fletcher's property. The county sheriff ruled it an accidental fall, noting the dangerous terrain and the doctor's unfamiliarity with the area. His medical bag was found beside him. His notes about the Brenner family were scattered and unreadable, destroyed by rain and impact. The brothers learned what Silas had done through whispered conversations in the mine. James heard it from a man in town. Marcus overheard the sheriff discussing it at the general store. William saw Silas cleaning mud from his boots that matched the red clay near the cliff. Thomas simply knew, the way you know when something fundamental has shifted. They understood then that Silas would kill to protect his arrangement. The line they'd thought existed, the boundary between control and murder, had been an illusion. They were all involved now, bound by silence as surely as by the debt papers Silas held over them. Marcus stopped even pretending to function. He drank from morning until he passed out at night. His work in the mine became dangerous as his hands shook and his judgment failed. Twice he nearly caused cave-ins. The other miners refused to work near him. Silas reduced his wages for incompetence but didn't stop him from drinking. A broken Marcus was easier to control than a sober one. Thomas grew reckless in different ways. During his rotation months, he'd tell Abigail detailed plans for escape. They'd take Sarah and the 2 boys he claimed as his and leave in the middle of the night, head west where Silas's reach couldn't follow. He drew maps, saved small amounts of money he skimmed from his wages before Silas could collect. Abigail listened but no longer believed. She'd learned that hope was more dangerous than despair. Hope made you vulnerable. Hope got doctors killed on cliffs. She'd stopped crying, stopped fighting, stopped feeling much of anything. Survival required numbness, but Thomas wouldn't accept her resignation. He pushed harder, made bolder plans, started treating the children he believed were his with open favoritism. During James's rotation month, Thomas would still try to visit Abigail, breaking the rules Silas had established. Silas noticed everything. James reported Thomas's rule violations with satisfaction, earning himself reduced fees and Silas's trust. He'd become the enforcer completely now, taking pleasure in catching violations, in maintaining the system. The arrangement had corrupted him in ways different from the others. Where Marcus drowned in guilt and William retreated into silence, James had embraced the horror and made it his identity. One evening, Thomas confronted Silas directly in front of all the brothers. "This has to end. We've become monsters. That doctor's blood is on all our hands now. And for what? So you can collect wages and keep a notebook? This isn't life. This is hell." Silas closed his notebook carefully. His movements were precise. "You want out? Fine, pay what you owe. Every dollar you've earned from the mine, every fee you've paid for access to Abigail, I'll refund it. Calculate your true debt to the original creditors, settle that, and you're free to leave." Thomas's face fell. The numbers would be impossible. Years of accumulated debt, interest piling up, the original amount multiplied beyond any hope of payment. Silas had designed the trap perfectly, or, Silas continued, "you can accept that this is how things are. This is how they'll remain. And any man who threatens that reality will have an accident just like the good doctor did." The threat hung in the air, clear and undeniable. Thomas looked at his brothers, at Abigail, at the children playing in the corner, and saw no allies. Marcus was too drunk to help. William too broken. James too corrupted. He was alone against Silas's methodical cruelty. That night, Thomas made plans without telling anyone. He gathered supplies in secret and hid them in the woods near the mine entrance. He'd leave alone first, establish himself somewhere distant, then send for Sarah and the others. It was the only way, but Silas knew. James had been watching, had seen Thomas hiding supplies, and reported everything. Silas said nothing, just made notes in his notebook and waited for Thomas to make his move. When prey ran, predators followed. It was the natural order of things. Thomas chose a moonless night 3 weeks later when Silas would be making his monthly trip to town for supplies. He kissed Sarah goodbye while she slept, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Then he slipped into the darkness toward where he'd hidden his supplies near the mine entrance. He never saw Silas waiting in the shadows, never suspected that his brother had known about the escape attempt from the beginning. Silas had watched Thomas gather supplies for weeks and had chosen this specific night to spring the trap. The first blow came from behind, a shovel connecting with Thomas's skull hard enough to drop him to his knees. He turned dazed and saw Silas standing over him with James beside him. Both were holding tools that glinted dully in the starlight. "Thought you were clever," Silas said calmly. "Thought I wouldn't notice my own brother stealing from me, planning to take what's mine." "She's not yours," Thomas gasped, blood running down his face. "None of this is yours. You've twisted everything into something evil, and you've broken the arrangement. There are consequences for that." They dragged him into the mine. His boots scraped against rock as he struggled. The shaft went deep into the mountain, held up with wooden supports that creaked under the weight of earth above. Silas pulled Thomas to a section they'd been meaning to reinforce, where the ceiling showed cracks and the supports looked questionable. "Mining accidents happen," Silas said, positioning Thomas against the wall, "especially when men get careless, when they work alone in unstable sections." "Tragic, really," Thomas understood then. "You're going to bury me alive. I'm going to let the mountain do it." "There's a difference." Silas handed James a pickaxe. "Weaken those support beams. Make it look natural." James hesitated for just a moment, the last flicker of his humanity showing through. Then he raised the pickaxe and struck the first beam. Wood splintered. "Dust rained down from above. Please," Thomas begged. "Think about the children. Sarah needs a father." "She has 4 others," Silas replied. "She'll manage." The second beam cracked under James's assault. The ceiling groaned, a deep sound that came from the mountain itself. Thomas screamed, pulling against the ropes binding him. But Silas had tied knots learned in prison, knots designed to hold desperate men. From outside the mine, Abigail heard the scream cut short. She'd been standing at the cabin window, unable to sleep, sensing something terrible approaching. She ran toward the mine entrance just as a rumbling boom echoed through the valley, just as dust and debris exploded from the opening. Silas and James emerged, coughing, covered in coal dust, their clothes torn. Behind them, the shaft had collapsed completely. Tons of rock and earth sealed Thomas inside forever. "What have you done?" Abigail screamed, trying to push past them into the mine. Silas grabbed her arm. His grip was iron. There was an accident. Thomas was working late, reinforcing the supports. The section collapsed. "We barely escaped ourselves. You murdered him." "You murdered him like you murdered the doctor." "Careful what you say," Silas warned. His voice dropped. "Grief makes people say foolish things. But accusations like that, they can get you locked away in institutions for hysterical women. You want me to have you committed? Leave our children without a mother?" She saw the threat clearly. Silas held all the power, the law, the money, the documentation, proving her compliance in the arrangement. She had no proof of Thomas's murder, no witness except James who'd helped. Speaking the truth would only destroy her further. 3 days later, they held a memorial service. The preacher spoke about the dangers of mining, about God's mysterious ways. Marcus stood swaying, drunk. William stared at nothing. James shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet anyone's eyes. And Silas read from his Bible with perfect composure. Sarah cried for her father while Abigail held her, both of them knowing but unable to speak the truth. Thomas was gone, sealed in darkness beneath tons of mountain. And with him died Abigail's last hope that anyone would challenge Silas's control. That night, Silas added a new entry to his notebook under household changes. Thomas's name crossed out. His rotation eliminated, the schedule adjusted to 4 brothers instead of 5. Everything documented, everything accounted for. And beneath that notation, in smaller writing, he wrote simply, "Discipline maintained." Thomas's death changed the math of the household in ways Silas hadn't expected. With 4 brothers instead of 5, each rotation grew longer. Each man's turn stretched to 6 weeks instead of 4. The extended exposure to the arrangement's horror accelerated their deterioration. Marcus's liver began failing within the year. His skin took on a yellow color. His eyes clouded. His hands developed a constant tremor that made even simple tasks impossible. He could no longer work the mine effectively, stumbling through shifts and creating hazards. Silas reduced his wages accordingly, but kept him in the rotation, making Marcus pay for time he was too drunk to use. One morning, Marcus simply didn't wake up. They found him in the bunkhouse. His body had finally surrendered to the poison he'd been feeding it. The doctor who came to sign the death certificate noted cirrhosis of the liver, chronic alcoholism. He didn't ask uncomfortable questions about why a man might drink himself to death in his 30s. Silas adjusted the notebook again, crossing out Marcus's name, redistributing the rotation among 3. Now each brother's turn lasted 2 months, 8 weeks of enforced intimacy with a woman who'd become a stranger to herself. William had grown stranger as the years passed. He'd taken to talking to himself in the woods, having full conversations with people who weren't there. Sometimes he'd disappear for days, living wild in the forest before hunger drove him back. During his rotation months, he barely acknowledged Abigail's presence, treating her like furniture, going through mechanical motions before retreating to whatever internal world he'd constructed. But William had also been watching, learning, gathering pieces of evidence. He'd found Dr. Tucker's medical bag hidden in Silas's trunk one day while searching for tools. The leather was still stained with blood. The instruments inside were tarnished but recognizable. He discovered the section of the notebook where Silas documented external threats and realized Thomas's death had been planned ahead of time, executed with the same cold precision as everything else. William confronted Silas one evening after supper. The medical bag was clutched in his trembling hands. "You kept it. You kept proof of what you did to the doctor. Why would you do something so stupid?" Silas looked up from his notebook, unconcerned. "Because no one will believe a word you say. You're known as the crazy brother, the one who talks to ghosts. Even if you went to the sheriff, even if you showed him that bag, who's to say you didn't steal it yourself? Who's to say you're not the one who killed the doctor during one of your episodes?" "You've thought of everything," William whispered. "I learned in prison that you control people by controlling the story. The story people believe becomes the truth. And the story about you, William, is that you're insane, violent, unpredictable." William stood there holding the bag, understanding that Silas was right. He'd been labeled, categorized, dismissed. His testimony would be worthless. Worse than worthless, it would give Silas an excuse to have him locked away in an institution. He dropped the bag and walked into the forest. This time, he didn't come back for 3 weeks. When he finally returned, something essential had broken inside him. He worked his shifts in the mine like a sleepwalker, endured his rotations in complete silence, and spent every other moment staring at nothing. James had become fully monstrous now. With only 3 brothers remaining, his power had grown. Silas trusted him completely, relied on him to maintain order, to report rule violations. James had even suggested they could acquire another woman since Abigail was aging. He'd proposed expanding the operation. Silas had actually considered it before deciding the risk outweighed the profit. More children arrived despite everything. Abigail's 14th pregnancy ended in a daughter who wouldn't live past her first week, too weak to survive whatever poison ran through her mother's blood. Silas noted the death in his notebook, calculated the lost future labor value, and adjusted the household accounts accordingly. Abigail had spent these years learning, watching, planning with the patience of someone who'd accepted she might not live to see her revenge completed. She studied the herbs mountain women used for healing. She asked questions of the midwife who attended her births. She collected small amounts of poisonous plants from the forest, drying them in places no one would look, grinding them into powders she stored in unmarked jars. She was building an arsenal. And when the time came, when she had enough, when the opportunity presented itself, she would use it. Abigail spent the summer preserving food with methodical care, preparing for the winter months when fresh supplies would be scarce. She made jams from wild berries, pickled vegetables from the garden, canned meat from animals the brothers brought home from hunting. The shelves in the root cellar filled with sealed jars, each labeled in her careful handwriting. What no one noticed was the subtle variation in ingredients. Some jars contained foxglove leaves ground fine and mixed with the preserves. Others held careful measures of water hemlock root processed to remove the bitter taste. Deadly nightshade berries went into certain jam batches. Their toxins were stable enough to survive the canning process. She'd spent years learning which plants killed quickly versus which caused slow deterioration. She'd experimented with amounts, with combinations, with methods of disguising the taste. The forest had become her laboratory, and her knowledge had grown precise. The trick was distribution. She needed to poison all 4 men without raising suspicion, without making it obvious that they'd all consumed the same contaminated food. So she created a system within Silas's system, using his own obsession with documentation against him. She marked the poisoned jars with tiny scratches near the base, invisible unless you knew to look. She kept track of which brother ate which jar, spreading the poison across weeks, across different foods, making each death appear unrelated to the others. In late autumn, she began serving the preserves at meals. Silas took his usual portion, praising the blackberry jam, unaware of the foxglove mixed into the fruit. James preferred the pickled vegetables, consuming jar after jar laced with water hemlock. William ate mechanically, not tasting the nightshade in his portions. Each man received his poison custom-tailored to his habits, his preferences, his portion sizes. The effects took time. Foxglove caused heart problems that could be blamed on the hard labor of mining. Water hemlock produced seizures that looked like accidents. Nightshade created delirium and confusion, symptoms that could be attributed to existing mental instability. Silas was first to show serious symptoms. His heart began beating irregularly, causing dizziness and chest pain. He attributed it to stress, to aging, never suspecting the jam he spread on his bread each morning was slowly destroying his heart. James's seizures started during a shift in the mine. He collapsed, convulsing. His co-workers carried him out into daylight where he thrashed and screamed. The doctor diagnosed epilepsy, a condition that could strike any man at any time. James survived that episode but grew weaker. His body accumulated poison with each meal. William's deterioration was harder to track since his mind had already been fractured. But the nightshade accelerated his decline, causing hallucinations violent enough that he'd attack shadows and scream at invisible enemies. Silas considered having him institutionalized but decided the expense wasn't justified. Better to let him burn himself out naturally. Through it all, Abigail maintained her routine. She cared for the children, prepared meals, rotated between the remaining brothers as the schedule demanded. She showed no emotion when Silas complained of heart palpitations, no concern when James had another seizure, no reaction when William raved about demons in the walls. She simply marked her jars, tracked her dosages, and waited. The poison worked slowly, but it worked. Each day the brothers grew weaker while she remained strong, patient, calculating the exact moment when she would serve the final meal. That moment came on a cold evening in early winter when all four brothers would be present for supper. She'd prepared a feast using the last of the preserved foods, the ones with the highest concentrations of toxins. She set the table carefully, placed each jar in front of its intended victim, and called the men to eat. They came hungry from a long day in the mine, tired and cold, grateful for the warm food and the woman who'd prepared it. They ate heartily, complimenting the flavors, reaching for seconds, and Abigail watched them consume their deaths. Her face showed nothing but the blank resignation they'd come to expect from her after 15 years of systematic destruction. The symptoms began within hours. Silas clutched his chest as his heart rhythm became chaotic, each beat irregular and painful. James convulsed on the floor, foam gathering at his mouth, his body seizing violently. William's hallucinations intensified into a full psychotic break. He screamed about snakes crawling through his veins. Even the strongest poison takes time to complete its work. The brothers died slowly over 2 days, while Abigail watched from her chair by the fire. Silas understood first. Through the pain and confusion, he looked at his wife with dawning comprehension. "You poisoned us," he gasped. "The food." "The preserves." "Yes," Abigail confirmed calmly. "I've been feeding you death for months. Tonight was just the final dose." "The children," he managed. "You fed our children the same food." "No, I gave them different jars, clean ones. Only you four ate from the marked containers. I learned to be as methodical as you, Silas. I kept records, too." He tried to reach for her, but his body wouldn't obey. His heart stuttered, stopped, restarted in rhythms that made breathing impossible. "Help!" he wheezed. "Get the doctor. Like you got the doctor for me. Like you helped when I begged you to stop." She stood looking down at him without pity. "You're going to die here, all four of you, and everyone will think it was natural causes. Bad preserves, tragic accident, whole family struck down by contaminated food. James died first." His seizures finally stopped as his brain shut down from the toxins flooding his system. William followed hours later. His mind fragmented completely before his body surrendered. They'd been the weakest. Their systems were already compromised. Silas lasted longest. His body fought with the same stubborn will that had controlled them all for 15 years. He watched Abigail move through the cabin, cleaning up evidence, hiding the marked jars, preparing the story she'd tell authorities. "You won't get away with this," he managed. "They'll know. They'll know that 4 men died from eating spoiled food. It happens in remote areas where refrigeration is poor. The doctor will see the symptoms, write contaminated preserves on the death certificates, and never question further." She leaned close to his face. "I learned from the best, Silas. You taught me how to control a story, how to document everything, how to make people believe what you want them to believe." She picked up his precious notebook. the one he'd maintained so carefully for 15 years, and threw it into the fire. The leather binding curled and blackened as flames consumed page after page of rotations, payments, notations about children's paternity, records of his systematic destruction of human dignity. "No," Silas whispered, watching his life's work burn. "Not the notebook. It never existed," Abigail said. "Just like your arrangement never existed. Just like none of this happened. You'll be remembered as a husband and brother who died tragically with his family, not as what you really were." Silas died as the last pages turned to ash. His eyes were fixed on the fireplace where 15 years of documentation disappeared into smoke. His final expression wasn't pain or fear, but fury at losing control of the story, at having his carefully maintained records erased. Decades later, Abigail lay dying in that same cabin, surrounded by her 14 surviving children and their families. Sarah, now a grandmother herself, held her mother's hand and listened as the old woman spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you need to know about your fathers," Abigail began. And over the next hour, she told them everything: the rotation system, the notebook, the murders of the doctor and Thomas, and finally, her own calculated revenge. Sarah wept, but not from shock. "We knew something was wrong. We always knew." "I saved the real notebook," Abigail admitted, "the one Silas kept. I didn't burn it. I couldn't destroy the only proof of what he did to me, what he did to all of us." She directed them to a loose board beneath the floor where the leather book had been hidden for 30 years. Sarah pulled it out and read page after page of clinical documentation of her mother's abuse. She saw her own name listed with Thomas designated as father, saw the monetary calculations, the notation about discipline maintained. "None of you will ever know for certain who fathered you," Abigail said. "That was Silas's cruelest trick. But you need to understand that I survived. I outlived all 5 of them, and in the end, I won." She died 3 days later with her children gathered around her bed. They buried her next to the brothers in the family plot, though they marked her grave with words Silas would have hated. She endured. The confession spread through the family like fire through dry timber. Descendants wrestled with the knowledge that their bloodline was confused beyond untangling, that their grandmother had been both victim and murderer, that their family tree was built on systematic abuse and calculated revenge. The leather notebook was donated eventually to the county archive, where historians found it decades later, and marveled at the clinical documentation of one of Appalachia's darkest family secrets. They published papers analyzing the economics of abuse, the systems of control, the ultimate justice delivered through patient revenge. If this story disturbed you, if it showed you how evil can wear the face of order, and how justice sometimes comes not from law but from the hands of the abused themselves, then click that like button and subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you the true cases history tried to bury, the stories that make you question everything you thought you knew about family and survival. Share this with someone who needs to understand that some victories take decades to achieve, and some women, his patience is more dangerous than any man's rage. The next story we bring you will be just as dark, just as real, and just as necessary to hear.